It's pretty wild, right? How much everything's changing these days.
Yeah, for sure.
Like, it's just constant, and the speed of it all,
Mm-hmm.
it's almost like, I don't know, the old playbooks don't quite work anymore, you know what I mean?
Totally.
Like, everything feels so much more complex,
Right.
more unknown, more unpredictable.
It's like the one quote that really hit home for me from all this stuff we've been looking at was, the times, they are a-changin' faster than ever.
Yeah.
There is more unknown and uncertainty than ever. And I mean, you can really feel that.
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
mean, it makes you think, right? Like, what kind of leadership can actually thrive
Yeah.
in this kind of crazy environment?
For sure, for sure.
And that's where this idea of daring leadership comes in.
Okay, daring leadership.
Yeah. And the source material puts it so well. We need braver leaders and more courageous cultures.
More courageous cultures.
Yeah.
So, I mean, when you think about your own leadership role, what does that look like in practice, this daring leadership thing? Like, what are the core elements?
Well, at its heart, a daring leader is someone who, and this is a direct quote that really stuck with me, takes responsibility for finding the potential in people and processes, and who has the courage to develop that potential.
Okay.
And, that really resonated with me because it's not about having all the answers yourself.
Right.
Right. It's about creating an environment where, growth and innovation can flourish, within your specific context.
Totally.
So it's about really seeing that potential in your team and in your operations and then having that courage to act on it.
Okay. That makes sense.
Yeah.
And I know, from some of the stuff you've been telling me about some of the initiatives you're working on, that really resonates with you.
It does. Yeah.
But the material also emphasizes leading with self-awareness and embracing vulnerability. And, for someone in your position, that might sound a bit, I don't know, counterintuitive, right?
It can, for sure.
In the traditional leadership sense.
Yeah.
But the source really presents it as absolutely crucial.
Yeah, like they're saying that real strength, like the kind that lets you navigate all this uncertainty we were just talking about, actually comes from, deeply understanding yourself.
Yeah.
And being willing to be open, even when it feels a little bit risky.
Right.
And then this idea also extends to fostering what they call courage cultures.
Courage cultures.
Where, within your teams, brave work and tough conversations and, really genuine engagement, that all becomes the expected norm.
So that's kind of a different way of thinking about the culture you're building in your own organization.
Yeah.
Now, the source material outlines 4 key skill sets for actually cultivating these, brave leaders in these courageous cultures.
Right.
So let's start with the first one, rumbling with vulnerability.
Okay.
What does that actually mean? Like, if you're thinking about your day-to-day interaction.
Okay, so rumbling with vulnerability, it's about having that courage to engage in those really honest conversations.
Yeah.
Even when they're uncomfortable, even when it's a little bit, touchy.
Right.
And it's about making this commitment, within your team meetings or your one-on-ones,
Yeah.
to lean into vulnerability.
Yeah, okay.
To stay curious about different perspectives, especially ones that challenge your own.
Right.
And to stick with the messy parts of problem solving.
Okay.
When it's not clear and it's not easy.
Yeah, yeah.
And it also means being willing to say, hey, I need a minute to process this.
Right.
Or, owning up to your part in a situation.
Okay.
And really, truly listening when someone else is speaking.
So, I mean, it's not about avoiding those difficult discussions, right?
No, not at all.
Because those are going to come up.
They always do.
It's more about shifting how you approach them.
Yeah, exactly.
So what's the outcome then? Like, what should you be aiming for in these conversations?
Well, ultimately, it's about serving the work.
Yeah.
Right. And the people involved, putting the collective good ahead of individual egos.
Okay.
It's about being able to say, let's have a real conversation about this, even if it gets a bit tense.
Yeah.
And, the source material makes this really good point, which is that you often come out of those rumbles with significant learning.
Okay.
By tackling the core issues head on, you can develop better coping mechanisms.
Yeah.
And more confidence in handling those future challenges.
Right. So it's almost like a muscle you're building.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
But let's talk about the word vulnerability for a second, because it can still feel a little, I don't know.
Oh, yeah.
Exposed, right?
Yeah.
Like, how is it defined in this context?
Okay, so in this context, vulnerability is defined as having your guard down. being open to new experiences, being open to the people you work with,
Yeah.
and acknowledging those emotions that come up.
Right.
Situations of uncertainty
Yeah.
when you're taking risks,
Right.
when there's emotional exposure.
Yeah.
It's about showing up authentically, even when you can't predict or control the outcome, which, let's face it, is most of the time, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Right.
And it's definitely not about weakness because I think a lot of people associate the two, right?
Absolutely.
Like vulnerability equals weakness.
Yeah, and the source is very clear about that. Like, vulnerability is not a sign of weakness.
Okay.
In fact, they actually present it as this powerful form of strength.
Interesting.
It involves acknowledging when things are tough,
Right.
taking that risk of potential hurt or failure,
Mm-hmm.
getting back up after you've had a setback,
Yeah.
and just being genuine
Okay.
in your interactions.
Yeah.
And all those things, it underpins so many critical leadership skills that you probably rely on already.
For sure.
Like being adaptable, having
Yeah.
those hard conversations,
Yeah.
giving and receiving feedback effectively, solving problems ethically,
Mm-hmm.
giving recognition in a meaningful way,
Yeah.
and building that resilience, both in yourself and in your team.
So it's really kind of foundational to everything else.
Yeah, it really is.
Now, the source even addresses some of the common myths around vulnerability.
Oh, yeah.
So let's look at a couple that, might resonate with you.
Okay, sounds good.
Myth number 1. Vulnerability is weakness.
Right. Well, the counter to that is essentially every act of courage you can think of involves vulnerability.
Okay.
You can't be truly brave without putting something meaningful at risk. And that always carries with it the potential for, failure or disappointment.
Yeah, you have to be willing to put yourself out there.
You do.
And another myth, myth number 5, I thought this was really interesting in the context of, building trust within a team.
Yeah.
Trust comes before vulnerability.
Yeah. So the source actually flips that around and says it's more like a reciprocal process.
Okay.
You need a certain level of trust to allow yourself to be vulnerable, but it's also through those, small and often uncomfortable moments of shared vulnerability that you actually deepen that trust. So it's like this gradual building process.
They kind of feed each other.
Yeah, they do. Yeah.
So to sum up rumbling with vulnerability, it's about what? Having the courage to show up authentically, especially when things are tough, and being willing to engage in those honest conversations.
That's a great summary.
With your team.
Yeah. And there's this great Brené Brown quote in the material. You can't get to courage without rumbling with vulnerability.
I like that.
Yeah, so true.
Okay, let's move on to the second skill set that the source highlights, living in our values.
Yeah, living in our values.
And this seems like it goes, way deeper than just having a list of values,
Yeah, it really does. Yeah.
on the wall.
Yeah, it's not just a poster. Right?
Exactly.
So a value in this context is it's this deeply held belief about the kind of person you want to be and how you want to act in the world.
Okay.
Your values, they provide this internal compass
Yeah.
that gives you strength when things get tough and, compels you to act in alignment with what you believe is important.
Okay.
So living into your values really means actively and consciously practicing those beliefs.
Okay.
So making sure that your intentions, your words, your thoughts, and your behaviors are all aligned.
Right. So it's not just about what you say.
No.
It's about what you do.
Exactly.
So why is that congruence so critical? Especially for someone in your leadership role.
Well, the source materials are really clear about this. They say that establishing clarity around your core values and then consistently living by those values.
Yeah.
That's a fundamental skill of daring leadership.
Okay.
Your values become your ethical framework. They guide your decisions, especially when you're faced with those tough choices.
Right.
Or when you're in the arena, as that Theodore Roosevelt quote so aptly put it.
Right.
It's about leading with integrity from the inside out.
Yeah, that makes sense.
No.
Now, how do you actually do that with your team, though? Because you can have your own personal values. But how do you get the team on board with that?
So the source touches on that, and they say that leaders play a really vital role in this by initiating those conversations with their team members about the unique contributions each person brings.
Right.
And helping everyone understand how their strengths and their roles connect to the bigger picture, to the overall purpose and values of the team.
Okay.
And it's also crucial to translate those values, which could be kind of abstract, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Into concrete behaviors.
Right.
So people know what it actually looks like to live those values in their daily work.
Yeah, that's helpful.
And then finally, it's about creating that culture of shared accountability.
Right.
For upholding those values.
Okay, so it's an ongoing process.
It is, yeah.
Okay, let's turn to the third skill set, braving trust.
Okay, trust.
And, I mean, given what we've talked about with team dynamics and the importance of collaboration, in your field, trust is just paramount, right?
It's everything, yeah.
So how does this daring leadership approach view building and maintaining trust?
So they highlight some research
Okay.
that identifies trust between managers and employees as basically the primary characteristic of the best workplaces.
Okay, so it's backed up by data.
It is, yeah.
Okay.
And they say that daring leaders actively cultivate this trust through specific behaviors, which are summarized by this really handy acronym, braving.
Braving. Okay, tell me more about that.
So B stands for boundaries.
Okay.
So this is about you and your team being clear on what's okay, what's not okay in terms of behavior and expectations.
Right.
And understanding the reasoning behind those boundaries.
Yep.
And setting those boundaries, that's actually presented as an act of bravery.
Interesting.
And it's essential for preventing resentment.
Okay.
Then you have R for reliability. This is about doing what you say you'll do.
Right.
Being aware of your own capabilities and limitations so you're not overcommitting.
Okay.
And following through on those promises.
Yep. So it's about being dependable.
It is, yes.
Okay.
Then you have A for accountability. This means owning your mistakes, apologizing, making amends. Okay. And they even give these 4 key phrases to use when you've messed up.
Oh, okay.
So like, I made a mistake.
Okay.
I am sorry. I don't know how.
Right.
And I need help.
Okay, so those are good to have in your back pocket.
They are.
All right, so that's the B, the R, the A. Yeah. What about the rest of braving?
All right, so V is for vault.
The vault. Okay.
And this one's about confidentiality. Not sharing information that isn't yours to share.
Right.
Respecting that privacy.
Okay.
Then we have I for integrity.
Okay.
And this means choosing courage over comfort. Doing what's right.
Yeah.
Even when it's hard.
Yeah.
And actually practicing your values, not just talking about them.
Okay.
And they suggest setting up those accountability measures, being transparent, modeling good character.
Right.
Then there's N for non-judgment. This is about creating an environment where everyone feels safe.
Right.
To ask for what they need.
Yeah.
And express their feelings without being, criticized or judged.
So it's about psychological safety.
It is.
Okay.
And finally, G for generosity.
Okay.
Assuming the best intentions of others,
right,
but also having those clear boundaries in place.
Okay.
So that your generosity doesn't lead to, resentment or burnout.
Right.
And it's funny, they make this point that often the most generous people also have the strongest boundaries.
That's interesting.
Yeah, isn't it?
Now, we talked about all those elements of trust, but there's also the role of honesty in building that trust.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
Absolutely.
Especially when it involves those, harder conversations.
Yeah. And they actually say this very directly in the material. Clear is kind, unclear is unkind.
I like that.
Right.
Yeah.
So often we try to be gentle or we try to avoid conflict. And we end up being vague or indirect in our communication. Right. But they're saying that lack of clarity can actually be more harmful in the long run.
Yeah, because it erodes trust.
Exactly, and it creates confusion.
Okay.
So direct and honest communication, even when it's hard, is actually more respectful.
Right, because you're not, dancing around the issue.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
All right, let's move on to the fourth and final skill set.
Okay.
Learning to rise.
Learning to rise.
And given all the ups and downs that everyone faces, this one seems particularly relevant, right?
Yeah.
For you and your team.
Absolutely.
So what does learning to rise actually mean?
So it's essentially about developing resilience.
Resilience.
And the source defines that as the ability to recover from setbacks, adapt to change, and bounce back quickly from those tough experiences.
Okay.
It's about learning how to fall.
Right.
And maybe even more importantly, how to learn from those falls.
Right.
Right.
Okay, so it's not about avoiding the falls.
No, not at all.
It's about how you deal with them.
Exactly.
Now, the source puts a lot of emphasis on managing that fear of failure.
Yes.
Why is that so important?
Well, because fear of failure can be so paralyzing. It can prevent you and your team from taking the risks that you need to take to innovate and grow.
Right.
And they make this really important point, which is that just telling people to be resilient isn't enough.
Yeah.
You need to address those emotions
Yeah.
that come up around failure.
Right.
Because the people who develop real resilience, they're not the ones who avoid failure.
Right.
They're the ones who learn how to recover from it.
Yeah.
And they often come out of it even more courageous.
So it's about that failing forward idea.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Failing forward or failing intelligently.
Okay, so what does that look like in practice?
So it's about viewing mistakes
Mm-hmm.
not as like the end of the world, but as opportunities.
Mm-hmm.
Opportunities to learn and improve.
Okay.
And ultimately to drive future learning and innovation and agility.
Right.
And they make this interesting point that many traditional work environments, they kind of inadvertently teach us to avoid failure at all costs.
Yeah, because failure is seen as a bad thing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that can really stifle creativity and risk-taking.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
Now, the source also gives these historical examples of people who had huge setbacks,
Oh, yeah.
but then went on to be incredibly successful.
Yeah, they have Christopher Columbus,
Right.
who missed America.
Yeah.
The Wright brothers with their almost fatal attempts at flight.
Mm-hmm.
Steve Jobs with his early hardware failures at Apple.
Yeah.
And even Albert Einstein, who struggled academically as a student.
Wow. So it's a pretty impressive list.
It is.
And it shows you that, setbacks are part of the journey.
For sure.
Now, what are some of the tips that they give for failing forward?
So some of the key tips are having no regrets, like focusing on the learning, not on the what-ifs,
Okay.
accepting reality,
Mm-hmm.
rather than dwelling in blame, approaching the situation strategically, not as a victim,
Right.
maintaining focus on the path forward,
Yeah.
seeing each day as a new opportunity to learn,
Okay.
and even learning to laugh at mistakes.
Right. To kind of diffuse that negative impact.
Exactly.
Now, this learning to rise process itself is described as a 3-step journey.
Yeah.
Can you walk me through those steps?
Sure. So the first step is the reckoning.
Okay.
And this is about becoming aware of and curious about
Yeah.
your emotional response
Mm-hmm.
when you've had a setback.
Okay.
So instead of immediately reacting or blaming external factors,
Right.
it's about pausing,
Okay.
acknowledging your emotions, and trying to understand them.
All right. So that's step 1, the reckoning.
Yeah.
What about step 2?
Step 2 is the rumble.
Okay.
And this is where you own your part,
Mm-hmm.
in what happened.
Yeah.
You engage in honest self-reflection, but without beating yourself up.
Right.
And you avoid creating those false narratives
Huh.
or leaving out important details based on your fears or biases.
Right. So you're really being honest with yourself
You are, yeah.
and with the situation.
Yeah.
Okay.
And a key part of this is distinguishing between the facts and your opinions.
Right.
Like what actually happened versus how you're interpreting it.
Okay. And what's the third step?
The third step is the revolution.
The revolution. All right.
And this is about reclaiming your agency.
Yeah.
Learning from the experience.
Yeah.
Letting go of any, armor you might be carrying.
Right. That self-protection stuff.
Exactly.
Okay.
And ultimately choosing to move forward with greater courage and self-awareness.
Okay. So we've talked about these 4 skill sets now. Rumbling with vulnerability, living in our values, braving trust, and learning to rise.
Yeah.
And they all seem really interconnected.
They are, for sure.
But the material then shifts to talking about overcoming fear and getting out of your own way as a leader. So how do those concepts all tie together?
Well, they emphasize this really direct link between vulnerability and fear.
Oh.
Often our reluctance to be vulnerable comes from those underlying fears.
Mm-hmm. Of what?
Of rejection, of criticism, of judgment.
Yeah.
And they're saying that choosing courage and vulnerability, despite those fears, that's the path to real growth.
Both personally and professionally.
Yeah, exactly.
And the source lays out these 5 truths about fear.
Right.
That are really, really powerful to consider.
Yeah, they are.
So what are they?
Okay, so first, fear never really goes away.
Okay.
As long as you're growing.
Right.
It's part of the deal.
So you're always going to have some level of fear.
Yeah, as long as you're pushing your boundaries.
Okay.
Second, the only way to get rid of the fear of doing something is to actually do it.
Right.
So simple, but so true.
Yeah.
Third, doing something, even just taking a small step,
Yeah.
is often the key to feeling better about yourself.
Okay.
Fourth, everyone experiences fear when they're in unfamiliar territory.
So you're not alone.
No, not at all.
All right.
And fifth, and this one's really empowering, pushing through that fear is often less frightening than living with that feeling of helplessness.
That comes from avoiding it.
Exactly.
Now, the source also talks about not internalizing criticism.
Right.
Which can be a huge obstacle to being vulnerable.
It can, yeah.
And to taking those courageous actions.
Yeah, they make the point that often criticism says more about the person giving it than it does about you.
Okay.
Like their perspective, their experiences. And if you let yourself get too caught up in other people's opinions, it really limits your capacity for vulnerability and bold action.
So it's about not letting that criticism define you.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
And they make this really interesting point that the biggest barrier to brave leadership isn't actually fear itself. It's how we respond to that fear.
Exactly.
And that's where this idea of armor comes in. So what do they mean by armor?
So armor refers to those thoughts, emotions, and behaviors that we use to protect ourselves when we're not willing to be vulnerable or confront our fears.
Okay.
So it's like this shield we put up.
Yeah, but it's not necessarily helpful, right?
No, because while it's meant to protect us, it actually hinders our ability to connect and to grow as leaders.
And what are some of the examples they give of that, like, internal armoring up dialogue?
So things like, I'm not enough.
Okay.
Or the fear that if you're truly honest, it'll be used against you.
Yeah.
Or rationalizing dishonesty as being strategic.
Right.
Or blaming others, or even adopting that posture of superiority.
Okay, so those are all ways of protecting ourselves.
They are, yeah.
But they're not really serving us in the long run.
Not at all.
Okay. And the source really emphasizes the importance of overcoming that fear of making mistakes.
Yeah.
And confronting the feeling of shame.
Right.
Because, you know, shame can be really debilitating.
Absolutely.
And they call it the never good enough emotion?
Yeah, the never good enough emotion.
And how did they define shame?
So they define shame as that really intensely painful feeling of believing that you're flawed and unworthy of love and belonging and connection.
Yeah.
And it's something we all experience.
Right, it's universal.
It is, yeah.
But it becomes really powerful when it's not addressed.
Yeah, when we keep it hidden.
And they give these indicators of shame in an organizational culture.
Yes, things like perfectionism.
Okay.
Favoritism, gossiping, back-channeling, comparing people or teams.
Yeah.
A sense of self-worth being tied only to productivity.
Right.
Harassment, discrimination, abuses of power, bullying, blaming, covering up mistakes.
So a lot of negativity.
Yeah, and they emphasize that all of that undermines innovation, trust, connection, and the overall health of the culture.
So if shame is so damaging, what's the antidote?
Well, they have a very clear answer to that. Empathy. Yeah, they even quote Brené Brown directly, saying, empathy is the antidote to shame.
Interesting.
And they present empathy as being essential for building strong connections, fostering trust, and creating those teams that feel safe enough to take risks and be innovative.
Okay, and they outline 5 skills for cultivating empathy.
Right.
What are those?
So trying to see the world from the other person's perspective.
Okay.
Valuing those diverse viewpoints.
Yeah.
Being non-judgmental.
Right.
Making an effort to understand the other person's feelings and the needs driving those feelings.
Okay.
Communicating your understanding back to them.
Yeah.
And, you know, as we mentioned earlier, genuinely valuing those diverse perspectives.
So it's about really trying to understand where the other person is coming from.
Exactly.
Okay. Now, the source concludes by talking about creating a courageous culture.
Okay.
So how do we go from these individual acts of daring leadership to building a culture where these principles are just ingrained in the organization?
So they're saying we need to consciously create a culture where brave work, tough conversations, and wholehearted engagement are the norm.
Okay.
And where that armor becomes unnecessary.
Right, because people feel safe.
Exactly.
And they say that creativity and innovation are direct outcomes of that kind of environment.
Yeah, because when vulnerability is met with support, not criticism, people feel safe to share their ideas and take risks.
Right. And they say, specifically in a courageous culture, no idea is a bad idea, at least in those early stages of brainstorming.
Yes, exactly.
Why is that so important?
Because the creative process is messy, you know?
Right.
It's about trial and error.
Yeah.
And if people are afraid to share those imperfect ideas,
you're
not going to get anything truly original.
Right. You're going to stifle that innovation.
Exactly.
Okay.
And they also talk about the importance of promoting a safe space where everyone...
It's pretty wild, right? How much everything's changing these days.
Yeah, for sure.
Like, it's just constant. And the speed of it all, it's almost like I don't know, the old playbooks don't quite work anymore, you know what I mean?
Totally.
Like everything feels so much more complex,
Right.
more unknown, more unpredictable.
It's like the one quote that really hit home for me from all this stuff we've been looking at was, the times, they are a-changin' faster than ever.
Yeah.
There is more unknown and uncertainty than ever. And I mean, you can really feel that.
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
mean, it makes you think, right? Like, what kind of leadership can actually thrive
Yeah.
in this kind of crazy environment?
For sure, for sure.
And that's where this idea of daring leadership comes in.
Okay, daring leadership.
Yeah. And the source material puts it so well. We need braver leaders and more courageous cultures.
More courageous cultures.
Yeah.
So, I mean, when you think about your own leadership role, what does that look like in practice, this daring leadership thing? Like, what are the core elements?
Well, at its heart, a daring leader is someone who, and this is a direct quote that really stuck with me, takes responsibility for finding the potential in people and processes, and who has the courage to develop that potential.
Okay.
And, that really resonated with me because it's not about having all the answers yourself.
Right.
Right. It's about creating an environment where, growth and innovation can flourish, within your specific context.
Totally.
So it's about really seeing that potential in your team and in your operations and then having that courage to act on it.
Okay. That makes sense.
Yeah.
And I know, from some of the stuff you've been telling me about some of the initiatives you're working on, that really resonates with you.
It does. Yeah.
But the material also emphasizes leading with self-awareness and embracing vulnerability. And, for someone in your position, that might sound a bit, I don't know, counterintuitive, right?
It can, for sure.
In the traditional leadership sense.
Yeah.
But the source really presents it as absolute